welcome aboard. We're going to recap a little bit of digestion, everyone, and go through the different parts. Basically, the pathway of food, we're just going to recap that. We're going to recap all the different enzymes, and then this is going to lead us into a little project on diabetes and the insulin response. All right, so we have a little person here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to start off with the oral cavity. And this is where we get mechanical digestion. This is the teeth, this is the tongue. Remember that the tongue is going to ball up the food into a food bolus. All right. And now we also have salivary glands, and they produce salivary amylase. And remember, salivary amylase breaks things down, breaks carbohydrates down from polysaccharides to disaccharides. All right. So moving down, we have our food bolus going past, excuse me, going past our mouth, going into our pharynx, and our pharynx is like our throat, and then it leads down into the esophagus. Now remember, don't forget we've got our epiglottis right here, and this is going to prevent food from going down into our trachea so we don't choke and die. All right. Now we've got our esophagus, and remember that our esophagus is going to take the food to the stomach, and it moves that food via peristalsis. And this leads us into our stomach, and it's going to look like this. And right before our stomach, we've got our cardiac sphincter. And the cardiac sphincter is going to prevent things from sloshing around and going back up into our esophagus. All right, and then we've got our stomach, and remember that in our stomach, it physically breaks things down into smaller bits. It churns and squeezes, but the stomach also produces HCl, hydrochloric acid, and pepsinogen. Now this is found in our gastric pits. Now, the reason this is important is because hydrochloric acid and pepsinogen, the hydrochloric acid breaks off the O-gin part and leaves us with pepsin. And remember, pepsin breaks polypeptides down, and this is long chains of proteins into smaller polypeptides and sometimes dipeptides as well. All right, so now as we go from the stomach into our duodenum, which is the beginning of our small intestine, we also have the pyloric sphincter. And this just aids in gastric emptying. All right, so we're going to draw the liver in as well. So the liver's just to the right, which is opposite of what it looks like, but it's on your right-hand side. And your liver looks something like this, and you've got a gallbladder right here, and you've got your small intestine, which is the beginning, your duodenum, and it's right here, and then it's going to curl down and bring things into the large intestine. So we're just going to focus on the small intestine for a sec. We have our gallbladder and our bile duct that empties into our small intestine, our duodenum. And we also have our pancreas right over here, and it also leaves gastric or enzymes into the small intestine to break things down. All right, so this is our pancreas, and this is our liver. All right, and so and we've also got our gallbladder right here. And that what happens is the liver actually makes the bile, and it's stored in the gallbladder and then released into the duodenum when people eat fatty foods. All right, so what we've got, let's start with the pancreas here. And the pancreas there's a few things that it makes. The most important thing it does, pretty much, is that it creates sodium bicarbonate. And what that does is it neutralizes the acidic chyme that comes from the stomach. So the stomach's going to release all this stuff. As you get hungry, it's going to release some stuff into your duodenum. And the pancreas releases sodium bicarbonate to bring the pH back up. The only enzyme that works at a low pH is pepsinogen/pepsin. All the other enzymes require a neutral or 7-ish type of pH. Another enzyme that the pancreas produces is pancreatic amylase. And remember that pancreatic amylase breaks polysaccharides down into disaccharides. So polysacs, and remember those are carbohydrates to disac. And then we also have trypsin, and trypsin breaks smaller polypeptide chains down into dipeptides. Okay, so we've got polypeps to dipeps. And then another enzyme is lipase. Lipase, now remember lipids are fats. And what they do is remember that lipids are made up of triglycerides, so glycerides and 3 fatty acids. And so they break them down into their components. They break it down into glycerol and 3 fatty acids. All right. Now, as going over to the liver has many different functions, but the main one for digestion is the fact that it produces bile. Now, I've got a little acronym here called BB-SPUD. And so the first function here is bile. And then we have blood cell breakdown. So it breaks down red blood cells and recycles them. So blood breakdown. It also regulates sugar, and we're going to be looking into that. It produces proteins, and those proteins are for clotting, and we're going to see that later on in the course. And then we've also got urea, and that's some of our urine. And then it also detoxifies our blood. All right, so it takes out all the poisons and stuff in our blood and cleans it all up. All right, so the bile goes into the gallbladder, and then the gallbladder releases the bile. Now, the bile is a mechanical digester. It only breaks fat into smaller globules. Now, what we're doing is we're getting into our duodenum. Remember that our duodenum is the first part of our small intestine. And this is where the rest of the chemical breakdown happens, okay? So all of those enzymes that I talked about from the pancreas, those are all made in the pancreas and secreted in the duodenum. All right. So now these next ones are produced in the duodenum and used in the duodenum. So the first one we have is peptidase, and this breaks down dipeptides into amino acids. And so the goal of all digestion is to break things down into the smallest parts. The next one we have that duodenum is going to produce is maltase. Now maltase breaks down, it's basically disaccharide into monosaccharide, and it breaks down a disaccharide, which is made up of 2 glucose molecules, into separate monomers of glucose. So disac to monomer, and this is the 2 monomers you get glucose plus glucose. The next one we have is sucrase, and this breaks down another disaccharide into monosaccharide. Same thing, but we get a glucose molecule and a fructose molecule. And then finally we have lactase. You'll notice that all the different enzymes end with A's. And from lactase breaks down lactose, and we get glucose and galactose. All right, so this happens all in the duodenum. Excuse me. And then once that happens, we go into the jejunum. This is the second part, and this is where all the absorption takes place. Now, let's just zoom in here to a little spot of the jejunum. Remember that if I was going to look at a cross section of our jejunum, what happens is I've got it's full of these things called microvilli, or villi and microvilli. And what they do is they increase the surface area. So if I look at this again, this has all these little villi, these microvilli, all over it. And what they do is they increase the surface area of the small intestine. It turns out that your small intestine has basically the same surface area as a tennis court, which is insane. But we need that so that we can absorb all these different molecules. And then finally, once we get past the jejunum, we get to the ileum. And this leads us to the ileocecal junction, which is right here. And this gives us to our large intestine. And it kind of goes back and up and over. We've got a ascending colon. Then we've got our transverse colon, which goes on the top. And then we've got our descending colon, which goes out into our anus. All right. Now, our large intestine, we'll just finish up here shortly. We've got our large intestine. The main function of this one is that it absorbs water. It also absorbs a lot of bile salts. It brings things back and so that we can recycle it. It's like 90% of the water that we use gets pulled back in. Otherwise, we'd be having very watery feces all the time. Okay, it absorbs a lot of water. It also compacts feces, as well as there's a lot of bacteria in there that help produce many different things. And one of the key things is vitamin K. And vitamin K is really, really important for clotting. All right, so take a gander at that and make sure that you guys know all the different enzymes and their functions. And now we're going to be going on to some the functions of the liver and then looking at insulin and diabetes. All right, take care.